you. So yeah, hello, is this working? You can hit, yeah, cool, right. So yeah, welcome to my talk about how testing stopped my side hustle from self-destructing. So to make money, I am a senior software engineer, but to waste money, my own and everybody else's time, I like to try and build my own products. The latest of which is a self-reflective journaling app called Ghana that I built in 2024 to 2025. So for this talk, I'm going to cover how I came up with the idea for Ghana, how I messed that up, and how testing helped to stop me messing up and get back on track. But first, let me give you the elevator pitch for my app, Ghana. I guess you probably already knew this might happen. But before I tell you about the app, I want to demonstrate the problem. So unfortunately for you, this means I'm going to ask for some audience participation. So first, can you put your hand up if you've switched jobs in your career? Oh. Now, keep your hand up if you knew exactly what to write about your most recent job when writing your CV or job application. Oh, so about half of the people put their hands down. Now, keep your hand raised if you felt that when you were asked about those things, you could actually provide strong evidence. So we're down to what, like 5 or 6 people? And then for those who still have their hands up, what approach did you use to keep on top of all of that? So for the 2 people that are still 3 people, has anybody got shout out anything that worked for you?
Yeah, so I regularly keep my CV up to date
Mm-hmm.
On a weekly basis if I've done something I feel like is relevant. But when that falls by the wayside, it's...
Cool. Any others?
Exercise, sometimes planning, I've got too much to do, and I use a certain to-do list system which kind of brings a really good list of what I've done and the kind of big pieces on which I organise it for, and that feeds very nicely into the system.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, mostly it's like a weekly exercise, right? Just trying to keep going, which is very hard to do, especially if you've got certain things that mean that your brain forgets everything, which is what I have. So to go back over those questions that I asked, I would have put my hand down at that second question. Someone had suggested to me that keeping a simple brag book would have helped, but that is because I tend to undervalue things that I do. I had managed to keep a simple bullet journal, however, so I decided to start making a habit of journaling once a week about the things that I did at work in Obsidian. And as I wrote those journals, I found myself not only focusing on what I did, but how that made me feel, and then reflecting on those feelings. And over time, I began to understand that understand what my personal and professional needs were. Eventually, I decided that I can enhance that approach and decided to make an app. So that's basically how I got to Ghana. So as I worked on the app, it was clear that I needed to explain what that app offered to people who would use it. And to do this, I kind of turned the way I was working into a system with 3 simple steps. So there's the reflection step, which is basically where you write a journal and then you do the self-reflection in that what you've written. The grow step, which is where you take those understandings from that reflection and create trackable actions to help you grow both personally and professionally. And then thrive, which is where you use the journal entries and the actions to create content for your CV or to help prepare evidence for performance reviews. But it's also a cycle, because as you do more of the thrive side of things, you end up unlocking things to reflect on. So that's the app itself, but let's look at how I got into this mess in the first place. So after landing on the idea for the reflective journal, I started looking at user research platforms that I could use to get real people's thoughts on journaling and using those journal entries to create CVs. I found Ballpark a good tool for this. It allows you to create surveys to conduct user research and has excellent respondent recruitment tools. I was able to get a trial for like 5 survey respondents for free, which I then asked some initial open-ended questions to generate ideas from, so similar to what I did here with that thing. And then I followed that up by paying some money to ask 20 people more pointed, closed questions to get some quantitative data on journaling and CV generation. And that survey had some really positive results for me. So 75% of the responders indicated that they thought it was a good idea to keep a log of stuff. 55% felt that they were already keeping a log of things and that they would basically use that in their CV or review generation. And then 60% wanted a means to do the logging and use that as a career coach. And that was enough for me to basically indicate that I was solving my own problem, but also solving other people's problems. So I started mapping out my MVP. So the job of the MVP was then to expose the thinnest slice of functionality that would demonstrate the value of that reflect, grow, and thrive system. So I mapped out the functionality I wanted to build into a user story map, which is this horrible thing here that you can't really read, and pulled together a basic feature set that would show the way that the user could update the questions they were asked over time so that they could add and remove them as the reflection needs changed, do the reflection itself, be reminded to reflect, and export the reflection data in a human readable format so that you could use whichever tooling they wanted to make use of it. And then this would allow me to explore if the user wanted to update their questions or that they were asked and how often they would do that, if users found value in being reminded to reflect or if it was more of an ad hoc thing, and which tooling those users were piping the data they exported into. So then I had an idea of what I wanted to build. I needed to think about how I was going to build it. And this meant figuring out a good tech stack for the app. I had a few priorities that I wanted. The first thing, I didn't want to handle user data. It's a massive risk, and I'd rather avoid that if I could. I wanted the means to be able to have multiple apps share the same data source so that I could create an ecosystem of apps working together. And then eventually that Thrive step that I was doing would be pulling content from journals and putting them into CVs and other things like that. So I might need AI to do that. Realistically, based on my previous attempts at building products, there were only two platforms I was going to look at, which is web and iOS. Android in the past, basically, I was selling it for 99p. I had so many users on Android, nobody paid for it. So first, I looked at what the web would offer. A web app would give me a faster deployment time, but to share data across different web apps, I'd need to have a server and manage user data, which is something I didn't want to do. An AI for the web app would require using a third-party service, something that would involve managing cost per request, and or asking users to provide their own details, which is a bit of a faff. So then I looked at iOS. So an iOS app would give me access to iCloud, which would take care of accounts and storing user data for me, and the app groups that you get would also allow me to share that data across multiple apps. At the time, Apple was gearing up to release Apple Intelligence, which is a future update to iOS, bringing access to foundation models, which would allow you to do prompt engineering within the app. And they also announced a new framework for dealing with database, which is called Swift Data. So iOS felt like a no-brainer for me. And with that, I decided to move on to the next step, which is figuring out what my UI would look like. So I used an iOS design system in Figma to basically pull together some Swift UI looking prototypes of the three screens that the app would have, which is basically a setting screens for setting up the questions to answer in a reflection and to also set a reminder to reflect. The reflection list, which would basically be where you can see your reflections and then add one, and the actual form for doing the reflection itself. And once I had those screens designed, I felt like I was ready to start coding. So I used Swift Data and Swift UI to implement those screens because I was hoping that this would future-proof the app because Apple told me that would happen and that the query hooks would make the development easier because, again, Apple told me that would happen. Well, within a few hours, I had an MVP done and I was ready to start showing people. But first, I wanted to have a play around with it myself. And that's when the fun stopped. The app had some issues. So adding questions didn't mean the reflection entry screen would actually have those questions. Questions could be ordered, but you couldn't actually depend on that order showing up in the reflection screen, which is awesome. And the app crashed when you entered text into the inputs, which, as you can imagine, building a journaling app that crashes when you write in a journal is a bit shit. So what did I do wrong? As it was a tech stack that it was new to me, I tried to focus on understanding the architecture and not actually defining the behavior itself. I had written user stories that said where the value for the user was, and I had mock-ups in Figma as well to show how it would work. But as things started to go wrong, I didn't actually have a definitive behavior of what I should be comparing what's going on to. Essentially, I was building a small chunk, seeing it work in the toy example, and then as I was using it in anger, it broke in new and miraculous ways. And this made it really hard to iterate on my ideas because I never knew if the data was going to be where it needed to be. The biggest reason nothing worked, however, was because I didn't know about iOS development enough. And I didn't know that you should never really trust a new framework from Apple. Swift Data is great for basic list detail apps, so standard kind of iOS apps really, that you can put together over a weekend, but it's by no means battle tested. Apple make claims that Swift Data will do away with old development patterns that iOS developers have been using for years, claiming that those are too much overhead and get in the way of people being able to do stuff. However, those old patterns provided the means to bake quality into the app instead of just hacking something together and hoping for the best. And when I did this talk at Leeds Mobile, someone in the audience asked, why would you trust Apple? I didn't know any better, right? It's my first iOS app. So now let's look at the bit about testing. So how I use testing to fix the issues. So as mentioned a couple of slides back, I had written user stories as a loose definition of the system. I was also using those user stories as the framing for the mockups I was building in Figma and the analytics events and visualizations that I was doing in PostHog. This approach worked well, as tying those to the value of the feature allowed me to explore it, but it wasn't low level enough to have a definitive answer about how the system would behave. In the case of my MVP, a user story like, as a user, I want to be able to customize my reflection questions so that I can change what I reflect on as my situation changes, tells me it's important to not have static questions. It doesn't tell me, though, that when I reorder a question, I should see that order change in the next reflection, but not update any existing reflections questions ordering. Nor does it mention that the reminder system should work with that new order. So I needed something a bit more definitive. So Swift Data means that the app needs to be running in order to test things properly. And with this in mind, I looked into test frameworks that could give me quick win based on the user stories that I already had. Now, I have no love for gherking. I've only ever seen it make things harder. But I thought, as I was working at the user story level, it might be time to justify trying again. The alternative would be that I spin up a test case management tool and spend ages putting everything I had into it. So Swift has a library called Cutworm, which executes Gherkin, although not in the same way that Cucumber does. So instead of gluing the step definitions to functions, Cutworm tells the test runner which step the next actions will be done. I don't know if you can really see it too well, but there's these bits here where it says scenario and given and when and all that kind of jazz. I can't comment on if this approach is nicer or not because they're kind of two different ecosystems. But I would definitely say that I prefer the more immediate feedback from Cucumber as if a step definition not linked to the code. But that's all I had to work with, so I had to do it. So hopefully this is going to play. If not, we're going to have some fun. There we go. So this is a demo of basically what Cutworm's doing here. You can't really see it because, again, slide quality is probably, but you can see it's kind of spitting out some stuff here. So this is the scenario, and then oh, that's great. Okay. Those 4 green blobs were supposed to be the output. But yeah, unfortunately, Cutworm wasn't the problem in the end. It turned out to be iOS and the testability of iOS itself. My app had schedule notifications, right? I'm doing reminders. You need to be able to schedule something to pop up. And that proved to be a pain to cover by automation. So I ended up having to manually test those. But without any system outside of my basic Gherkin feature files, it was proving hard to keep track of the test runs and the defects that were coming out of those test runs. So as the set scenario grew, I decided to bite the bullet and I set up Jira for my app. Is that now going to play again? It is, isn't it? Ah, there we go. Right. So I had been trying to avoid setting up a lot of infrastructure for the app. In the past, this has been my undoing, as I'd spend ages building the most perfect test suite and then lose all the energy to actually continue building things. But it felt like the right time to make that investment now, because I had done it so many times, I knew what I was doing, and it needed to be done. So I created basic user stories in Jira, then created basic test cases against those in X-Ray. This allowed me to ditch the convoluted Gherkin format and just focus on very simple step instructions. And that worked real for a couple of reasons. So I no longer had to link my automated test to the actual definition of the steps because they were linked to the ticket in Jira. Removing that link between the step definition meant that I could then update that step definition as needed, which was useful as fixing bugs led to me changing the system behavior. And then I could create a test execution, meaning that I could track the overall quality of the app as I fix things. And that helped me feel energized as I was faced with a wall of defects. And with that test execution, I could also create comments and document my thinking at that time, as each execution had a different level of understanding. So this was useful to ensure I was thinking correctly as I acquired new knowledge. And this mix of regression and exploratory testing was key to me being able to claw back control and the understanding of my MVP. Because, I was basically able to, kind of figure out what was going wrong, make a document on it, fix a bug. It was a nice cycle. But running a set of manual tests every time that you make a change isn't the quickest way to know if things break. And to do that, I had to look at a better way of getting feedback. So I looked at unit testing. Now, one of the blockers for automated unit testing is that Apple tell you that Swift data is special and magic, and it's so good it does away with the old patterns like the model view model pattern, or MVVM. This is because the magic is how Swift data saves the data to the database compared to the older core data framework. With core data, you needed to explicitly manage your data lifecycle, whereas Swift data saves a context when the user changes a view or on like a timer. In the past, with the core data approach, developers would then use a view model to wrap the core data model interactions and then handle the view's data needs. And this view model approach had the added benefit of allowing you to unit test because you could test the view independently of the data that's being fed into it. But Apple being Apple, they focus on the developer experience and see this pattern as too much overhead, especially when they want to sell the vision of being able to whip up an app over a weekend to idiots like me. So luckily, the website Hacking with Swift, which is an excellent resource for Swift knowledge, showed how to build MVVN with Swift data. So I was able to start porting my existing code into that pattern and getting some fast feedback on how the views in my app were working. I was then able to build a view model, add unit tests that covered off the behavior as expected, make sure that they passed, and then run a manual test to find out what broke in new and fun ways, and then add more unit testing around those. And eventually everything was green, and my MVP was no longer a hacky mess. So when I did this talk at Leeds Mobile, somebody asked me why I didn't just have AI write my unit tests for me. But I was doing this back in 2024, right? Xcode didn't have AI tooling built into it, so that was the main reason. But also, I've been using Claude in Xcode now for a couple of weeks, and its testing capabilities are terrible. So it's written tests that just test that the test pass and don't do anything. Tests that create a test double, then check that the test double returns the values that I set it to return, instead of testing the code that actually calls it. An amazing set of tests where it asserted that a Boolean was either true or false. And then my favorite, which is where it wrote a suite of tests for a function that did a calculation and just checked that the value was more than 0 for each test case. So while I think I can relax knowing that my job is safe, I think it's worth anybody here who works with devs who are using AI to write their code and to write their tests especially to ensure that those tests are being reviewed. So once I got to a point where I was confident that my app was ready to release, it was time to press the big scary button to publish it. But before I could do that, I needed to make sure I had analytics in order to capture the usage signals from users and measure how that usage of the app aligned to my expectations, right? Because that's why I was doing all of this. So I used PostHog for this, as it provides really solid qualitative analytics tooling, as well as in-app feedback tooling. And I then released the app. So I was able to do the thing that actually mattered, which is to get feedback from my idea from users and iterate towards something valuable. And once the app was in the App Store, I started becoming that annoying guy that keeps asking everybody that they bump into about their app idea, right? So I kept moaning and trying to arrange conversations with people around reflective journaling and sharing my app with them and trying to collect feedback on the idea. I think the main thing with that is it's important to conduct that type of feedback with non-leading open questions. So your analytics are going to give you an insight into how users use your app and which features they use, but use those sessions with actual people to get them to provide you with the views of how those features fit into the task they're actually trying to complete and understand their needs on that. My filing system for this, though, does definitely leave a lot to be desired. That is my whiteboard. You can't understand that. I can't understand that. But someone said some stuff. And now it's time for my final thought. So it can be hard to wear all the hats, as they are often in conflict with each other. And sometimes they do pair really well, right? The product design and test hats, for instance, work great at capturing user value, exploring the idea, and then providing guide rails for the implementation stage. The product and developer hats should also be working together to find a good enough framework that enables for quick experimentation so that you can learn more about the user and iterate quickly to provide value. And if, like me, you're having to engage the developer hat a lot more because the framework is a pain to work with, then you'll need to be able to make a call on whether or not it's fit for your purpose or make it work for you. And for me, this was ignoring Apple's advice and using the established patterns that made testing easier. Basically, be objective when it comes to your tech choices and processes, make a list of what you want them to do and ensure that you have a plan instead of just jumping in. But while I talk about objectiveness, I think it's important to point out that being subjective is also helpful. I had a lot of energy to sink into my app because I was solving my own problem. I was engaged and more willing to spend the time on it because I believed in the end goal. Writing test cases was also easier because I knew what I wanted and also what would annoy me as a user of the app. So I could force myself to really think about how I wanted to recover from those errors and other weird states. But engagement is a double-edged sword. You might be have more of a willingness to do stuff, but you also be too invested in the outcomes and it will hit harder when it fails. But I'll leave you with one final thought. Take care of yourself and each other. So, any questions? Or do I have time for questions, I guess?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Right. Cool. Yep.
I sort of like reflect every Friday at work,
Mm.
PDPs, you know, rather than have to think about what I did for the last 6 months. Can this do that?
Yeah, I mean, basically the way it works is you just have a bunch of questions that you ask yourself every week.
It's not just tied to careers.
No. I think the main thing of it is that, so we have a tool in my place, which is called Lattice, and that has a very similar thing, right? But the problem is that's owned by the company. So there will be things that you might not want to admit openly to, potential people reading it. For me, that's like a lot of the more negative sides of work. So that's why I built Garner, because it's like I should be able to say things are a bit shit and I want to do something about it. And actually then over time realize that I've made those changes that I need to make. I mean, I don't know, maybe. I think it's just important for me when you're doing these things to write candidly. That's the main thing. Cool, Kelly?
There might be some people in the room that might want to help test. Have you got a QR code that people could scan?
No, because what happened was I got so pissed off with it, I took it off the App Store. That's why I said to 2025. Roy at the back.
Yeah, so did anything that you learned building the app and discipleship you look back into your day job?
Yeah, so it kind of, I guess the main thing it did for me was it allowed me to have more product-centric kind of like conversations around things, because it was the first time that I was trying to build not only a product, but also try and do like the marketing and stuff like that. Because before I had done stuff in groups and I was just the developer guy, right? Whereas with this one, it was like, it's my baby and I was trying to make it good and then put it out into the world. And yeah, also dealing with people saying that my baby was ugly as well, which is what happens when you do this type of thing. And I think, when you're in a team, it's kind of, some people aren't used to that kind of feedback, right? So being able to bring that kind of perspective of like, it's okay to ship something that's not perfect and then deal with that kind of consequence of it instead of just focusing so much. I think it was probably the biggest thing that gave me. Cool. Anybody else got anything? No? All right, in that case then, over to you, Adam, I think.